Few people outside of the realm of paleontology realize that these runneled, sun-baked ridges which extend far into South Dakota are one of the great fossil beds of the North American age of mammals. Bones lay in the washes or projected from cliffs. Titanotheres, dirt-toothed cats, oreodonts, had left their bones in these sterile clays. The place was as haunted as the Valley of the Kings, but by great beasts who had ruled the planet when man was only a wispy experiment in the highlands of Kenya. These creatures had never had the misfortune to look upon a human face. Most of what we knew of mammalian evolution in North America had come from this region. The place enchanted me.
In the Badlands, the South Party found the bones of strange mammals that had ruled the earth after the dinosaurs were gone. Aenodon horridus, a wolf-like giant. Moropus, with a head like a horse and a rhino-like body. Protocerus, resembling an antelope. A primitive camel. And the Titanothere, whose petrified bones were believed by the Lakota Indians to be the remains of a spiritual being they called the Thunder Horse.
Some lands are flat and grass-covered and smile so evenly up at the sun that they seem forever youthful, untouched by man or time. Some are torn, ravaged, and convulsed like the features of profane old age. Rocks are wrenched up and exposed to view. Black pits receive the sun but give back no light. On the verge, where that prairie halted before a great wall of naked sandstone and clay, I came upon the slit. A narrow crack, worn by some descending torrent, had begun secretly, far back in the prairie grass, worked itself deeper and deeper into the fine sandstone.
In the slit, Eiseley found a skull, gleaming in the dim light. It was, for him, the ultimate symbol of the vastness of geologic time.
The skull lay tilted in such a manner that it stared, sightless, up at me as though I, too, were already caught a few feet above him in the strata. The creature had never lived to see a man, and what was it I was never going to see?
All right, let us now turn to the influence of Eiseley within writing. And we had ended the last segment talking about All the Strange Hours a bit, and I had mentioned to Bing a couple of weeks ago that I think Eiseley pioneered a new kind of essay form, what I call sort of the hidden personal essay. And I think probably the best example of that to me comes in The Night Country, where that's really a book that's in a sense an autobiography as well, even though it deals with science. And I've always thought whether it's fiction or it's autobiography, it's far more important to know what your character is looking at than to see the color of his eyes. What is behind those eyes and where it's looking at, that tells you more about character. What does that character notice? What is important to him? That'll give you a greater insight than merely describing the character. And I think All the Strange Hours is a perfect exemplar of that, in that we really don't know much about Eiseley's the whys, the wherefores, this one, but we know his soul. We know this guy. At the end of that book, if you could put him in any kind of situation and you'd have probably a 95% chance of being right on how he would react, what he would think. So with that being said, if either of you want to take that up, and then we'll talk a bit more about his influence. Would you basically agree with that, Tom or Bing?
Yeah, no, I think that he called it the concealed essay. That was his term for what we now use the standard term as creative nonfiction. I mean, people have been writing it before him. He didn't invent the form, but he sort of revived it and infused it with both the scientific material and also, as you say, the sort of deeply um, internal workings of a sort of subconscious mind. I think he blended those really well. And so I think he really revitalized that form and sort of put it on the map, and that has really served as an inspiration for a lot of writers today. I know that, people like Annie Dillard who are heavily influenced by Eiseley. Not like I mentioned earlier, when I meet nature writers today, which I do a lot because it's part of my job. And if I mention Eiseley, they almost invariably say, "Oh yes, I remember Eiseley. I read Eiseley when I was 20 or 25, and it really inspired me." Terry Tempest Williams was told me about how her grandmother she and her grandmother used to read Eiseley together aloud. Just a huge influence on the current, what we now think of as a sort of a, really since often dated with Ed Abbey's Desert Solitaire, this sort of outpouring of nature writing that happened starting in the late 60s. Eiseley was very much a precursor to and an important influence on that happening.
Yeah, and by the way, I was going to mention, but in between the last segment and this one, people will be seeing a segment from a Nebraska public television segment on Eiseley, about a 3 or 4 minute one, narrated by M. Scott Momaday. So I forgot to mention that earlier. Anyway. You mentioned Edward Abbey, and I've read Desert Solitaire, and I can certainly see, and a few of his other books, I can certainly see the connection. What would you say about a connection? Because I know Stephen Jay Gould came up in the early 70s, and then he wrote for many years for Natural History magazine, and he was someone, too, who incorporated things. It could be Joe DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak in baseball with some scientific law, or brontosaurus with some other minutia. Is there a writer, whether Edward Hoagland is another one who's done some things like that? Is there another writer that you can say is sort of directly a literary descendant of Eiseley?
Well, I mentioned E.O. Wilson earlier. Wilson is trying to. He wrote that book Consiliency, where he's trying to bring together the arts and humanities with the sciences. There, I think he's maybe one of the closest analogs to Eiseley's work. And he just wrote a new book called the Meaning of Human Existence. So he's not afraid to take on the big questions in the same way that Eiseley was willing to. Another writer I think is very much in Eiseley's tradition is David Quammen, who's very interested in the story of evolution. He wrote The Song of the Dodo, and he combines the personal narrative with the scientific information really well, and he writes really well. So that's some of the people today who I see definitely in his lineage. And as you mentioned earlier, that previous generation of people like Carl Sagan and people like that, the sort of the popularizers of science, people we really need. And it's very unfortunate that the discipline of science doesn't reward those people for doing that. Like if you're a professor at a university and you publish an article in a literary or popular magazine, it doesn't count for anything for your career. It's almost seen as a distraction, something you shouldn't be wasting your time on. And we really need those people. The American public seems to understand evolution less and less as time goes on, not more and more. We need people to explain those things to a wider audience. We're facing so many issues like climate change, where we need people with scientific credentials and credibility who can speak to the general public and explain why these things matter.
How about someone like? Have you ever read Barry Lopez? Would you?
Yeah, Lopez. Yeah, Barry Lopez. I'm sure that Lopez. In fact, I met with Barry about it's been a little over a year now, and he was definitely somebody who was influenced by Eiseley as well, and also somebody who's very interested in the sort of ethical dimensions of these things. That's something that was important to Eiseley as well, especially in our treatment of animals.
How about the publishing world? You said you had to get permission from the publishers to publish the Loren Eiseley Reader. What is the state of most of his books? I mean, does who owns the copyrights or the rights to most of his work? Is it his family, his estate, or is it the University of Nebraska? Who?
Well, it depends on which book, and it is kind of a kind of a tangled mess and a bit of a hassle. But a lot of his books are now owned by University of Nebraska Press. If the original publishers lost interest in them, they purchased the rights, and so they're now reprinting many of his books. The Immense Journey, not it's still owned by the original publisher, and also a lot of his poetry is not easily reprintable either. I had to pay a lot of permission fees when I was asked for a lot of permission fees for a book I did where it's quoting from Eiseley's poetry. So it's definitely, I mean, this is sort of an issue in publishing in general. It's not unique to Eiseley, but there can be a bit of a tangled mess as to who owns the copyrights to various items, and you sometimes can't reprint them easily.
Yeah, did Eiseley more sort of literarily see himself as a poet or a prose writer or essayist? What was his own view on his own literary output?
I think in some ways he often still referred to himself as a poet.
Yeah.
I think in his own mind, he, that youthful poet who was actually pretty good. And then even his later years, he cranked out a bunch of poetry books as well. But I think he also liked to use the word poet in that more general sense of a creative writer. That's a kind of an older sense of the meaning of the word, I think. But he must have known that his most important legacy would have been his prose creative nonfiction works.
Yeah, did he ever meet up with poets? We mentioned Robinson Jeffers earlier. Another poet that comes to mind is Kenneth Patchen, who also wrote a lot of poetry,
Right.
nature bound.
Right. Well, he was friends with W.H. Auden.
Okay.
And Auden wrote some intros to some of his poetry books, and so I think in terms of I mean, Auden's a big name too.
Yeah.
Auden's considered one of the major 20th century poets. So I think that was an important connection. He also corresponded, and I don't know how much he knew personally, but he corresponded with Howard Nemerov as well.
Yeah.
So,
Nemerov, I know. I've got. He's one of the better sonneteers of the last 50 years.
Yeah, and he was good friends with the other Nebraska author Wright Morris. They both grew up in Nebraska, and Wright Morris was a significant, well-known novelist in the mid to latter half of the 20th century, and his fame has very much declined. Some people trying to think about reviving some interest in him, but they both were transplanted Nebraskans to the East Coast, and they would meet up with each other, and for dinner or lunch or whatever, and talk. So I think that they were probably, as a fellow writer, I would guess Wright Morris was probably his closest companion.
What influence do you think that Nebraska and the terrain had on him? Now, I ask this because I think in my mind of five writers of significance coming from Nebraska: poet Weldon Keys.
Right.
There's a poet named James Emanuel you may never have heard of, but
I don't know him. No,
yeah, he's a black poet who recently died, and I've been trying to promote some of his poetry. Willa Cather, and then John G. Neihardt, Black Elk Speak. Nebraska isn't that populous, and these are five quality writers of the last 100 or so years.
Yeah, well, you could mention Maury Sandoz in that list as well, and our recent poet laureate of the U.S., Ted Kooser, as well.
Well, what do you think that there's something about, is Nebraska, is there a contemplative feature in writers because you're out on like a high plains or something? It just seems to me be interesting that it seems that per capita it's got a higher percentage than a lot of other states of quality writers.
Yeah, it is. I've noticed that some states seem to have a very rich literary tradition, and other states that seem quite similar to them in many ways don't seem to. I think some of it's just dumb luck, the odds. I think that most of the people you named, I think that the university had a role in shaping them. I think that sometimes it only takes one one really sharp, creative professor who's interested in creative writing to launch, a number of students out into the world. I think this state, the state of Nebraska, has had a long-term commitment to the promotion of the arts and humanities as a sort of public good, in a way that not every state has done that, and even in spite of what now are seen as fairly conservative politics, I would say that the arts and humanities are pretty well supported in the state, and I think that's been a long-term tradition in the state, and I think that's helped as well. I'm reluctant to attribute it to life on the Great Plains per se, because neighboring states, I don't want to be dismissive of the state of Kansas, for example, but I think it's fair to say that the state of Nebraska has a richer literary heritage than the state of Kansas, even though the natural environment is pretty similar.
Okay, well, let's end this segment, and in our next segment, I want to talk about Loren Eiseley, the role of public intellectuals, and how things have changed from his time to the current cyber age. So we'll get to that in a little bit here. So let's take a little break. All right, in this segment, I want to talk a little bit about 21st century discourse on science and how it differs from the time of the mid-20th century when Eiseley was sort of at his height. I was just mentioning in the break to both Tom and Bing that one of the frustrating things for me, and maybe it's not frustrating for a young person, but if you Google and try to find science debates or this or that, the first 1,000 things that come up is, Richard Dawkins debates so-and-so about the existence of God. Sam Harris destroys so-and-so about this. And recently, actually, I found a really great science debate between Jack Horner and a fellow named Nick Longrich, a fellow who I'm going to interview. I already interviewed Jack Horner, where they were debating real science, whether Torosaurus was an adult version of Triceratops. And I was very impressed with Nick Longrich, and that's one of the reasons I'm going to interview him. But that was real science. So I want to talk about, in the days of the 50s, 60s, 70s, even though clearly we didn't know as much back then, there seemed to be a more serious appreciation for science, for intellectualism than there is now. Everything now seems to be sugar-coated. It's sort of like children's cereal science. First off, do you guys agree with that? And what do you think Eiseley would think now, some 4 decades since his demise, about the state of science and whatnot in the public sphere? Either of you?
Well, I think he'd be shocked that we're still debating evolution. Just sort of dumbfounded that, and in this culture in which is so heavily reliant on science. Still, the basic principles of science are so widely rejected by so many people who benefit from the from the findings of science.
Yeah. What do you think about the way science reaches out? Because I know I have found some good YouTube channels where people there's a fellow that's affiliated with PBS that does some little 5 or 10 minute videos explaining basics of science, and there are a number of other good ones. There's a lot of bad ones, but there are some good ones. Do you think that, let's say, if he was in his prime now, do you think Eiseley would maybe make use of some of these modern media?
Probably not. He actually had a television program for a few months.
Oh, really? A public television or what?
A public. I don't even think it was public. I think this was back in the day when they were like on commercial TV. It was animal stories is what it was called.
Animal Imposters, was it that?
I thought it was, but anyhow, it was basically him sort of hosting a nature television program.
Was this when he was in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, and he was really bad at it. I have to say, it was like there were no production values at all. I've watched a couple episodes. Let's say he was no Steve Irwin, with the animals there. Pretty stiff. Apparently, he actually did not even own a television set. So I think he was I don't know. My guess is that he was suspicious enough about the virtues of new technology that I'm not sure he would be embracing the internet, for example, as I could be wrong, but I just sort of would be surprised if he did do that sort of thing.
You mentioned that, or we talked a bit earlier that Eiseley was not someone who is necessarily politically outspoken. He never took a public stance, for example, against the Vietnam War, did he?
No, in fact, he was actually somewhat of a supporter of the war. A lot of us find somewhat shockingly. Yeah, he was very skeptical of the anti-war movement.
What does anyone know what the basis of that was? His skepticism.
Well, I find that he grew increasingly conservative, and I mentioned earlier, I think he found that the counterculture just was not his taste. He thought it was naive, that its ideas about human nature were wrong, and that their idea of sort of attacking the institutions of society that Eiseley saw as flawed as they were nevertheless a sort of bulwark against a kind of anarchy that would have been very threatening. I think so in spite of all, I'd say his politics is a bit of a puzzle to me, because on some ways he was what we would now call very progressive on civil rights issues, for example, or on animal rights issues, and in other ways, in that one in particular, he seemed to have been rather reactionary.
Did he ever take place in any like public debates? Because I know, for example, back in the '60s, there were a lot of talk shows like William F. Buckley often
Yeah.
had. Was he ever on any of those sorts of shows?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think he would have been drawn to that sort of a venue particularly. I mean, it's surprising that he actually tried to do the animals, television show, and it may just because he did feel so passionate about the welfare of animals that he maybe decided that whatever reluctance he had towards that medium, he would nevertheless give it a shot.
How do you think that the dissemination of science information, especially to young people, educationally wise, I mean, Eiseley, I would say, considered himself an educator, certainly, since he
Right.
worked in the field. Do you think that he would be? I mean, you said you don't think he would have embraced modern media. What do you think his idea of the state of science education and education in general would be?
You want to try that, Bing?
I think that some of the things that we as a society is trying to do is to make science and learning much more hands-on, much more proactive. We see this attempt to catch up with other countries by spoon-feeding mathematics and scientific concepts. I think that Eiseley would probably think that probably is not going to lead to a great deal of success, and that's why we have started looking at what are the things that Eiseley had as a child that we could possibly use to encourage young children to explore and to be a part of nature. We're so much part of this connected world where you have video games, people against people, we playing games, video games, and learning seems to be teachers rushing to try to get to make certain that they cover the materials that are going to be on tests. Well, where is the inquiry? Where is the curiosity, which had such a profound impact on Eiseley? And that's some of the things that I think he would question. That he, in his quest, for instance, to in the middle of the winter to finding a broken aquarium, he wanted to see if he dug his hands into a pond and brought up the muck and mire and put it into this repaired aquarium set, what would grow? And this inquiry, the sense of curiosity, is something that I think that he would find that he would not agree with. in the way we educate our young children. The other thing that I think he probably would be concerned about, even though he was a loner, I think he did have his gang of guys, his troop of friends that he would go wandering through the sunflower forest of Lincoln with. It's this activity of getting out and doing things with others and by himself, this actual exposure and immersion into the natural world. And we seem to be very antiseptic. We don't like getting our hands dirty. We don't seem to want to engage in a meaningful way. This passivity that we have are things that I think Eiseley would not favor today.
Let me end this segment asking you, Bing, two things in the last 20 years I remember have sort of struck me as sort of failures of science to get out to the general public, and I'm wondering if you might have an idea of what your personal opinion is and what you might think Eiseley is. The first one is I'd mentioned earlier Stephen Jay Gould as someone who to me is sort of a descendant essayist of Eiseley, and one of his most famous essays is Bully for Brontosaurus, where he really makes an impassioned defense of the use of the term Brontosaurus, even though and how in a sense the priority and sort of the egos of scientists have sort of said to hell with Brontosaurus, even though it was probably the most famous dinosaur for 100 years name wise, because of one little error the name has now been discarded, and I know there are scientific priority reasons for that. And then the second one is recently, just less than a decade ago, there was the famous demotion of Pluto from a planet to a dwarf planet, which seems so ridiculous since, a dwarf human is a human, so a dwarf planet has to be a planet, so it seems ridiculous. And it seems to me those kinds of follies where it seems almost that science wants to say, well, we're sort of the Buddhas and we'll decide what is right or what not. I'm wondering if you agree with that, and do you think that those kinds of what I would call at least public faux pas in dealing with the dissemination of information, do you think what do you think Eiseley might think of that, Bing?
Well, I think Eiseley himself, he referred to these as saber-toothed cats, and his essay on the innocent assassins talks about the saber-toothed cat from millions of years older than what Nimvarus brachiops actually was. He took a little poetic license, and you realize that you're doing this because it fits the context of the poem that you're writing, and I think he would probably feel somewhat similar about the Brontosaurus and Pluto, as do I. I know there's a scientific correctness to the way that we want to revise the writings. It almost has kind of an 1984 feel to it, rewriting what we have come to accept as commonplace truths. And I think sometimes we take ourselves a little too seriously. Is Pluto really a asteroidal object rather than a planet? Well, by the strict definitions that astronomers have come up with, I suppose they're correct. But in terms of the popular writings and the way the public perceives things, could it be regarded as a planet? Certainly. I agree with that.
Okay, let's end this segment, and in the next segment, let us talk about the society a bit more and the website and what it has to offer. So let's take a little break.
Loren Eiseley from The Invisible Island. Islands can be regarded as something thrust up into recent time out of a primordial past. In a sense, they belong to different times, a crab time, or a turtle time, or even a lemur time, as on Madagascar. it is possible to conceive an island that could contain a future time, something not quite in simultaneous relationship with the rest of the world. Perhaps in some obscure way, everything living is on a different time plane. As for man, he is the most curious of all. He fits no plane, no visible island. He is bounded by no shore except a shore of shadows. He has emerged almost as soundlessly as a mushroom in the night. Islands are also places of extremes. They frequently produce opposites. On them may exist dwarf creations induced by lack of space or food. On the other hand, an open ecological niche, a lack of enemies, and some equally unopposed genetic drift may as readily produce giantism. The celebrated example of the monster Galapagos turtles comes immediately to mind. Man constitutes an even more unique spectacle, for, beginning dwarfed and helpless within nature, he has become a Brocken spectre as vast, murk-filled, and threatening as that described in old Germanic folk tales. Thomas de Quincey used to maintain that if one crossed oneself, this looming apparition of light and mist would do the same, but with reluctance and, sometimes, with an air of evasion. One may account this as natural in the case of an illusion moving against a cloud bank, but there is, in its delayed, uncertain gesture, a hint of ambiguity and terror projected from the original human climber on the mountain. To the discerning eye there is, thus, about both this creature and his reflection something partaking of both microscopic and gigantic dimensions. In some such way man arose upon an island, not on a visible oceanic island, but in some hidden forest meadow. Man's selfhood, his future reality, was produced within the invisible island of his brain. The island clouded in a mist of sound. In this way, the net of life was once more wrenched aside so that an impalpable shadow quickly wriggled through its strands into a new, unheard-of dimension of existence. Following this incredible event, the natural world subsided once more into its place. There was, of course, somewhere in the depths of time, a physical location where this episode took place. Unlike the sea barriers that Darwin had found constricting his island novelties, there had now appeared a single island whose shores seemed potentially limitless. This island, no matter where it had physically arisen, had been created by sound vibrating with meaning into the empty air. The island was based on man's most tremendous tool, the word. By degrees, the word would separate past from present, project the unseen future, contain the absent along with the real, and define them to human advantage. Man was no longer confined, like the animal, to what lay before his eyes or his own immediate attention. He could juxtapose, divide, and rearrange his world mentally. Upon the wilderness of the real, men came to project a phantom domain, the world of culture. In the end, their cities would lie congregated and gleaming like the nerve ganglions of an expanding brain. Words would eventually raise specters so vast that man cowered and whimpered where, as an animal, he had seen nothing either to reverence or to fear. Words expressed in substance would widen his powers. Words, because he used them ill, would occasionally torture and imprison him. They would also lift him into regions of great light. Even the barbarian North, far from the white cities of the Mediterranean, would come to speak in wonder of the skald who could unlock the word hoard. In our day, this phantom island has embraced the planet, a world from which man has begun to eye the farther stars.
All right, and to mention in the end of the last segment, there's another little segment in between these segments with my wife reading from the Invisible Island, not the Invisible Island, the Invisible Island segment.
Invisible Pyramid?
No, it's actually the Invisible Island.
Oh.
It's an essay my wife recorded a couple of days ago from Eiseley's reading. But that is a nice segue because I wanted to just touch back a little bit more in depth about the Loren Eiseley Society itself. We talked earlier about its founding and its aims, and we know that there's a terrific Loren Eiseley reader that's available. And it was, what, a $25 membership, Tom?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. There's a $10 student rate as well. So
okay, and what features are on the website? Bing had mentioned earlier there's a reader for how to teach Eiseley or teach the Loren Eiseley reader. Is that going to be available online in a PDF or anything?
Yeah, it's associated with the reader itself. There's a variety of teachers' guides so that people who want to try teaching Eiseley in a classroom can take a look and see, what the suggestions are and what other people have done with him.
And that's www.eiseley.org, and that's
Eiseley.org. That's right. Yeah. So in spite of our discussion earlier of his skepticism of technology, we're embracing what we can.
Right. It's EISELEY. Eiseley, not.
And if you Google Loren Eiseley, it's the first thing that comes up usually. So
yeah. So I know earlier I had mentioned I have a little brief clip from the Bone Hunter PBS segment. What other stuff is available on the website, Tom?
Well, there's some information on his biographies, biographical material there. There are these multimedia links, so in addition to that Reflections of a Bone Hunter piece, there's also some pieces that Ray Bradbury did for the Society. There's a piece on from Western Nebraska on Innocent Assassins, a sort of discussion of that poem, and some video clips of the landscape in which Eiseley worked out there, and then there are some talks that other people have given. Myself and a few other people are on there as well about Eiseley. So there's also information on touring Nebraska or Lincoln and going to visit some of the Eiseley associated sites. In the past we've taken I've taken students and others to his childhood home in Lincoln. It's still there. It's a rental house now. Somebody else lives in there, but it's interesting to see and how small it is. And
is there anything that's could be say a state monument or something? And does Eiseley have like a statue or anything?
Well, he actually has a statue in the state capitol building. There's a bust. There are sort of monuments to famous Nebraskans, and so he's got a bust in there. There's also a public library, the Loren Eiseley branch of the Lincoln Public Library, named for him. So that's it's a newer library. It's not the one where he always went when he was a kid, but that's a nice recognition as well. You had mentioned famous Nebraska authors earlier. They all sort of live in the shadow of Willa Cather.
Yeah, and she actually wasn't born in Nebraska.
No, actually she wasn't. She was born in Virginia and moved here when she was about 6. But he's got some. We're trying to increase the recognition, for sure. We've talked about putting, say, a historical marker in front of his house, that sort of thing. So. There's also a hiking trail biking trail that the city's establishing that follows a route that roughly he followed that being described earlier, that we're talking to the city about naming it the Loren Eiseley Trail. I have no idea if that's going to happen, but that's something we're trying to promote.
I know in the Loren Eiseley Reader there are some photos from Eiseley's youth, and there's also a map. Loren Eiseley's in Nebraska. Is any of that featured on the website?
That map we have links to that particular map there, and in fact the Center for Great Plains Studies that I'm affiliated with at the university has just started a big Great Plains ecotourism project, and I've been working with them a little bit on making Eiseley-related sites part of that, because they have one of their featured areas for ecotourism is the Fossil Freeway, which is a section out in western Nebraska where Eiseley and others found a lot of fossils, and you can still find fossils. And so I've been working with them to link up with some of the Eiseley material about that area.
Okay, now Bing, since you're the president, let me ask you, what do you see as the future of the Loren Eiseley Society 5, 10, 20 years down the line? What would you say in 2030, what would you like the society to be and its influence in the next 15, 20 years?
Well, in the certainly that far out, I would hope that the society will be a clearinghouse of hosting ideas on Eiseley's writings, and that there be an international following for Eiseley, that that humanity has woken up and realized that perhaps Loren Eiseley, more than in a way similar to Lao Tzu and Buddha, the wisdom of a very sage man advising humanity on the need to consciously to re-enter the sunflower forest to regain our sense of balance and our sanity as a species. That we really are need to be the shepherds of life on Earth rather than the takers. We need to make certain that we understand our place on planet Earth and to treat our tenure here as one that is a bestowed gift upon us. And as a thinking species, we need to take responsibility for making certain that we live to the next moment. His writings clearly state some of this. In the short term, what we're trying to do, I think Ray Bradbury, in my last visit with him, he asked me to, I said, Ray, would you like me to read from something to you? And he said, yes, go pick up my copy of the Reader there, which was close to his bed. And I started picking passages from there. And in perhaps 20 minutes into this, he was resting, and suddenly his eyes came over and he grabbed my arm and he says, do not forget, Bing, that I want you to bring Eiseley's word back into the mainstream so that his message resonates. And we will look at Nebraska as being sort of like the ripples of a pond, and that his ideas will emanate forth again, the sage from the plains.
Yeah. In looking for interesting people to interview myself, I came across something on YouTube called the Philoctetes Center. It's now defunct, where they had hosted a lot of discussions, roundtables with people in the arts, sciences, philosophy, etc. And there were some good talks. And I was wondering, maybe 5, 10 years, is there any plan maybe that you might hold like a Loren Eiseley conference or a speaker series or something?
Right. Well, we did have on the centennial of his birth. There was a conference in Lincoln, where we had a number of great speakers, and we've thought about doing something along those lines periodically.
Yeah.
But at this point, a lot of the activities are focused around the Reader and promoting the Reader and getting it out to the schools and getting people to teach it more.
Yeah, and I know that's one of the reasons I wanted to do the interview, was to put this up on YouTube, because I think, like it or not, and whether Eiseley would like it or not, I think that's probably the best way to go to get it out there. And I think I'd mentioned to Bing that another thing too, once I get this online, it would be a good thing to have someone maybe at the university, if they have time, to put a transcript of it so people can search for your answers and get specific things as well. And so I'm just suggesting that myself to help get Eiseley out there.
Right.
So let's take a break and we'll close this up, and I'll give both Tom and Bing final closing remarks, and then I'll close the interview as well. So in a final segment, we will do that. All right, we're going to end this interview on Loren Eiseley, his life and career, that I've had with Tom Lynch and Bing Chen, the Vice President and President of the Loren Eiseley Society. And just as I ended my written interviews, I like to end the interviews with giving each of the fellows a closing statement or whatever you want to talk about Eiseley or anything else. So Tom, why don't you give your end things here?
Yeah, sure. I was just, when we were discussing Eiseley's skepticism of technology and perhaps some irony that we're doing this for YouTube, we're using Skype and whatnot, reminded me to mention that we also, the Eiseley Society has a Facebook page, and people can like Loren Eiseley, and then we will.
And I'll link to that too as well.
Okay, keep people updated, and there's and when you talk about the global reach of that's great. There are people on there from all over the world, so that's really fabulous. The thing I wanted to say more generally was I was just a couple of weeks ago teaching Eiseley again, that Judgment of the Birds essay, and I just remembered the thing that stayed with me for years and years after I first read that essay as a freshman in college was the scene where Eiseley's out in the sort of the barren areas of a Toadstool Park area of western Nebraska, and the sun's going down, it's twilight, and he sees in the landscape around him all of the materials of life, carbon, phosphorus, iron, sort of in the soil, and he sees a flight of migrating warblers coming across that fairly desolate landscape, and he picks up the soil in his hand, and he holds it up and sort of says, there goes iron, there goes phosphorus, there goes nitrogen, there goes carbon, and to me that really epitomized the wonder of existence, that out of this stuff, this physical, chemicals of the universe, something as wonderful as a migrating warbler had evolved. The magic of that is really, I think, at the core of Eiseley's message, and how to appreciate that.
Okay, and Bing, how about you? Final statement.
Okay, I'd like to take a quote to share with our viewers from The Invisible Pyramid, and particularly the section called The Last Magician.
Okay.
Collective man, at the moment of his journey into space, has met himself in the doorway of the stars, and the looming shadows before him has pointed backward into the entangled gloom of a forest from which it has been his purpose to escape. Man has crossed in his history 2 worlds. He must now enter another and forgotten one, but with the knowledge gained in the pathway to the moon. He must learn that whatever his powers as a magician, he lies under the spell of a greater and a green enchantment, which, try as he will, he can never avoid, however far he travels. The spell has been laid on him since the beginning of time, the spell of the natural world from which he sprang. So I think this is what I would like to end with. The idea of, he talks about the great saviors, and so he quotes, the story of the great saviors, whether Chinese, Indian, Greek, or Judaic, is the story of man in the process of enlightening himself, and simply by tools, but through the slow inward growth of the mind that made and yet mastered them through knowledge of itself. And then the last quote I'd like to share with you. Today's man's mounting numbers and his technological powers to pollute his environment reveal a single demanding necessity, the necessity for him consciously to re-enter and preserve for his own safety the old first world from which he originally emerged. His second world, drawn from his own brain, has brought him far, but it cannot take him out of nature, nor can he live by escaping the second world alone. He must make by way of his cultural world, an actual conscious re-entry into the sunflower forest he had thought merely to exploit or abandon. He must do this in order to survive. Man must be his last magician. He must seek his own way home.
Well,
So
go ahead.
This is taken from The Invisible Pyramid.
Okay, well, it was a pleasure talking to both of you, and hopefully this is one of the first things that helps get the knowledge of Loren Eiseley and his writings out a little bit further. The next Dan Schneider video interview, the fourth one, will be probably a week or two after your interview goes up, and that's going to be with a painter called Gilles Brevel. And I know hopefully Bing will have you and Tom maybe back sometime in the next couple of months, and a few months after that with maybe some other people who knew Loren Eiseley. And hopefully it's one of those things that may take some time, but hopefully younger people will get interested and find out more. Again, people interested in the website and the Loren Eiseley Society, it's www.eiseley.org, and I encourage everyone to go there as well. So Bing Chen, Lynch, thank you, and for our viewers, just stay tuned for the next interview.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Okay.